On November 9th, 1979, inside a titanium-hulled research vessel designated K-122, a Soviet acoustic engineer named Yevgeny Andropov connected a modified Sony T Walkman to a piezoelectric hydrophone array capable of intercepting electromagnetic leakage from undersea fiber optic cables. What happened next triggered the single most bizarre security incident in Cold War history, one that involved quantum entanglement before physicists even understood the term, a navigation error so catastrophic it rewrote NATO protocols, and a cassette tape containing what cryptographers would later call an impossible algorithm. Why would a submarine crew risk international war to transmit analog audio into the most secure military network on Earth? And what exactly was encoded on that cassette that made American intelligence destroy every copy, except one? Before we dive deeper into this submerged Cold War enigma, if you're fascinated by the hidden intersections of vintage technology and classified operations, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're exploring stories where obsolete hardware becomes the key to understanding modern encryption mysteries, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, 3 things you need to understand before we reconstruct that November night. First, the TPSL-2 Walkman wasn't just any portable cassette player. It contained a specific batch of recording heads manufactured in Japan between April and June 1979, using a cobalt-samarium alloy, later banned for producing unintended magnetic flux patterns. Second, NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain complex had recently upgraded to a hybrid system blending electromagnetic shielding with acoustic dampening, a response to rumors that Soviet intelligence had weaponized infrasound frequencies below 20 Hz to induce hallucinations in American radar operators. NASA theoretically encode data in the substrate beneath the ferric oxide layer. Sony never publicly acknowledged this, but internal documents from their Economia facility reference harmonic leakage in units 10,447 through 10,986, which matches the serial number range recovered from K1 to 2. The installation of rubberized acoustic baffles in Sector 7 created an unintended resonance chamber that could, under extraordinarily specific conditions, convert low-frequency vibrations into detectable electromagnetic signatures. Third, and this is where historical records get deliberately vague, a Norwegian fishing trawler named Bjørnsund reported unusually strong electromagnetic interference near the GI-UK gap on November 8th, exactly 17 hours before K-122's Walkman incident. The trawler's Captain Olav Eriksson disappeared 3 months later, and his logbook was classified by NATO until 2003, when a heavily redacted version revealed a single entry stating sky noise at 37 kHz. Duration unknown, source subliteral. Let's go back to 1978, when this operation actually began. The GRU's 16th Directorate, responsible for signals intelligence in maritime environments, had identified what they called the Cascade vulnerability, a theoretical exploit where analog audio signals could piggyback on the quantum noise floor of undersea communication cables. The physics seemed absurd. How could a magnetic tape generate enough coherent energy to penetrate shielded fiber optics buried under 3,000 meters of seawater? The answer lay in a phenomenon that wouldn't have a formal name until the 1990s: acoustic electromagnetic conversion through piezoelectric transduction. In crystalline seabed formations, certain regions of the North Atlantic, particularly near the Ray James Ridge, contain basaltic rock with naturally occurring quartz veins that act as massive, unintentional transducers. When subjected to precise, low-frequency vibrations, these formations convert acoustic energy into electromagnetic pulses that can couple with nearby cables through a process called evanescent wave tunneling. Soviet geologists had accidentally discovered this effect during seismic surveys in 1976, but it took 2 years and the accidental involvement of a consumer electronics device to weaponize it. Yevgeny Andropov wasn't a spy in any traditional sense. His official role aboard K-122 was as a sonar calibration technician, but his real expertise was in psychoacoustics, the study of how humans perceive sound. He'd published papers under a pseudonym in Western journals about binaural beat, frequencies and their potential to influence brainwave patterns, work that caught the attention of Colonel Dmitry Volkov, the officer overseeing the Cascade project. Volkov recognized that if you could embed specific frequency patterns into analog audio, and if those patterns could survive conversion through piezoelectric rock and fiber optic coupling, you might be able to inject malformed data packets directly into a military network's signal processing layer. The challenge was creating an audio source stable and precise enough to maintain phase coherence through multiple conversion steps. Military-grade signal generators were too large and power-hungry for submarine deployment, and they produced electromagnetic signatures that American SOCIS arrays could detect from hundreds of kilometers away. What Volkov needed was something small, battery-powered, magnetically self-contained, and ubiquitous enough that its presence wouldn't seem suspicious if discovered. He needed a Walkman. The cassette itself was manufactured in an East Berlin facility that no longer exists on any map. Declassified. Stasi files. Reference. Annalage 17. A laboratory beneath the Friedrichshain district where acousticians experimented with what they called Frequenzbeschleierung, or frequency obfuscation. The tape's ferric oxide coating contained microscopic particles of gadolinium, a rare earth element with unique magnetic properties that allowed for data storage in three-dimensional space rather than the linear track of a normal cassette. This meant a single tape could contain hundreds of hours of encoded information compressed into a standard 45-minute format, but only if played through a device with the exact magnetic head geometry of those specific Walkman units. The audio content was deliberately mundane. A recording of Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, performed by the Moscow Philharmonic in 1977. But beneath the music, encoded in phase relationships between harmonics and in amplitude modulations below the threshold of human hearing, was a 6-kilobyte payload that Soviet cryptographers had spent 8 months developing. What was in those 6 kilobytes? American intelligence never fully disclosed their findings, but leaked NSA memos from 1982 referenced non-deterministic state-machine instructions and Turing-complete audio. Codec phrases that suggest the tape contained actual executable code. K-122 entered the GIUK gap on November 7th, operating at a depth of 400 meters, deep enough to avoid surface traffic but shallow enough to maintain acoustic contact with the seabed. Our mission parameters were simple. Navigate to coordinates 60 to 1 4N. 2907 W, a seemingly random point in the North Atlantic that happened to sit directly above a quartz-rich basaltic formation, and exactly 340 kilometers from the nearest undersea cable junction that fed into NORAD's communication network. At precisely 23:47 GMT on November 9th, Andropov powered up the modified Walkman. The modifications were extensive. Soviet engineers had replaced the standard amplifier circuit with a custom design that could output 200 milliwatts instead of the usual 35, and they'd added a phase-locked loop oscillator synchronized to a rubidium atomic clock, ensuring that playback speed remained accurate to within 1 microsecond per hour. The hydrophone array, consisting of 12 piezoelectric discs arranged in a phased configuration, was clamped directly to the submarine's hull in a pattern calculated to maximize acoustic coupling with the ocean floor. When Andropov pressed play, the Walkman began transmitting Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony into the abyss at a frequency range between 18 and 22 kilohertz, just at the edge of human hearing. To anyone monitoring with conventional sonar, it would sound like nothing more than biological noise, the ambient clicks and groans of deep-sea life. What Soviet planners didn't anticipate was the Bjornsund factor. That Norwegian trawler wasn't just fishing. It was operating as part of a covert NATO program called Acoustic Sentinel, deploying experimental hydrophones to monitor Soviet submarine activity. When Ericsson detected the anomalous 37 kilohertz signal the previous day, it wasn't coming from K-122 directly, but from a test run that Andropov had conducted without authorization, attempting to verify his equipment's functionality. That test had worked too well. The piezoelectric transduction process had amplified his signal far beyond predicted levels, creating an electromagnetic pulse that propagated through the seafloor and coupled with multiple undersea cables simultaneously, including civilian telecommunications lines. For 17 hours, satellite phone calls between Europe and North America experienced inexplicable audio artifacts. Brief moments where background noise seemed to contain melodic patterns. 3 separate intelligence agencies detected the anomaly, but none could identify its source or purpose. Bitte, Tanke -122 commenced its actual mission. American cryptographers at Fort Meade were already analyzing recordings of those artifacts, though they wouldn't understand their significance for another week. Inside Cheyenne Mountain at the moment of transmission, nothing seemed unusual. NORAD's threat assessment systems continued their routine monitoring, tracking Soviet bomber patrols over the Arctic, cataloging naval movements in the Pacific, processing the endless stream of telemetry that defined Cold War vigilance. But in Sector 7, where acoustic dampening met electromagnetic shielding, something strange began happening to the signal processing equipment. Console operators in that section reported seeing ghost images on their displays, fleeting patterns that resembled waveform data, but didn't correspond to any known input source. These anomalies lasted only 9 minutes, the exact duration of Andropov's transmission window, and affected only systems within a specific frequency response range. Technicians initially blamed it on hardware malfunction, possibly a grounding issue in the newly installed acoustic baffles. It wasn't until 3 days later, when NSA liaison officer Commander Patricia Hendricks noticed similarities between the Cheyenne Mountain anomalies and the European telecommunications artifacts, that anyone considered they might be connected. Hendricks had access to both sets of data because she was part of a classified working group studying Soviet electronic warfare capabilities, and she had the specific expertise in signal processing to recognize that both incidents showed identical harmonic structures in their noise profiles. What she found when she ran a spectral analysis changed everything. The waveforms contained information, not random noise, not equipment malfunction, but deliberately structured data packets using an encoding scheme that resembled nothing in Western telecommunications standards. Hendricks brought her findings to Dr. Eugene Mallory, a mathematician at the Institute for Defense Analysis who specialized in information theory and cryptographic protocols. Mallory spent 6 weeks analyzing the recovered signals and his classified report, portions of which were declassified in 2019, described the encoding method as elegant and terrifying in equal measure. The system used what Mallory called adaptive frequency hopping, where each data bit was spread across multiple harmonics in a pattern that changed based on the content of previous bits, creating a self-modifying codec that was extraordinarily resistant to detection and decryption. More disturbing was his conclusion about the data's purpose. This wasn't an attempt to extract information from NORAD systems. It was an attempt to inject something into them. Mallory's analysis suggested that the payload, had it been fully received and executed, would have created what he termed a persistent state anomaly in NORAD's threat assessment algorithms. In modern terminology, we'd call it a logic bomb, malware designed to lie dormant until triggered by specific conditions. But in 1979, such concepts barely existed outside theoretical computer science. The Soviet Union never acknowledged K-122's mission. Official records show the submarine completing routine acoustic surveys in the Norwegian Sea during November 1979, with no mention of anything unusual. Yevgeny Andropov remained in service for another 6 years before retiring to a teaching position at the Leningrad Maritime Academy, where he died in 1993 of what was officially reported as a heart attack, though some former colleagues noted he'd been in excellent health and had recently begun writing a memoir. Colonel Volkov disappeared entirely. The last verified sighting was in Moscow in December 1979. After which his file goes blank. Western intelligence attempted to reconstruct the cascade methodology for years. The NSA's Project Aquatic Resonance, initiated in 1981, tried to replicate the acoustic electromagnetic conversion process using similar equipment and conditions. Their experiments, conducted in the Atlantic Test Range of Puerto Rico, achieved only marginal success. They could generate the electromagnetic coupling effect, but couldn't maintain the signal coherence necessary to transmit meaningful data. Something about the Soviet approach, whether it was a specific Walkman modification, the gadolinium-doped cassette tape, or some other factor they never disclosed, made their attempt uniquely effective. Here's where the story takes its most unsettling turn. In 1987, a package arrived at the NSA's headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, mailed from Helsinki with no return address. Inside was a cassette tape, identical in appearance to a standard commercial release, labeled in Russian as Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, Moscow Philharmonic, 1977. Also included was a small handwritten note in English that said only the symphony has 4 movements, but you've only heard 3. Analysis confirmed it was an authentic cascade tape with the same gadolinium-doped ferric oxide composition, the same multi-dimensional encoding structure. But when cryptographers examined its contents, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. The encoded payload was different from what K122 had transmitted in 1979. This version contained what appeared to be corrections to the original code, patches that fixed errors Soviet engineers had only discovered years after the mission, plus additional functionality that suggested the project had continued in secret long after. American intelligence assumed it had been abandoned. More disturbing were timestamps embedded in the metadata, indicating portions of the code had been compiled in 1986, 7 years after the K122 incident. Someone had kept developing Cascade, refining it, and now they were sharing their improvements with their old adversaries. Why? Dr. Mallory, who was brought back to analyze this new tape, produced a second classified report that remained sealed until 2021. In it, he proposed a hypothesis that most of his colleagues found too speculative to take seriously. But the Cascade payload wasn't merely malware in any conventional sense, but represented an early attempt at what we now call artificial intelligence. Mallory noted that the code's self-modifying structure and adaptive behavior suggested it was designed to learn from its environment, to evolve its own functionality based on the systems it encountered. The 1987 tape, he argued, wasn't just an update. It was evidence that the original payload had somehow continued to develop autonomously, improving itself through some process Mallory couldn't explain. His report concluded with a question that NASA's cybersecurity division is apparently still investigating. If a piece of code designed in 1979 could modify and improve itself for 8 years, what might it be capable of now, 45 years later? The technical specifications of what made Cascade theoretically functional reveal just how far ahead of its time the project was. Modern analysis of the recovered tapes shows that the encoding scheme used principles that wouldn't be formally described until quantum information theory matured in the late 1990s. The way harmonic phases were entangled across multiple frequencies resembles quantum superposition, where information exists in multiple states simultaneously until measured. The gadolinium particles in the tape's coding, with their unique magnetic properties, may have been creating microscopic quantum effects that allowed for information density far beyond what classical magnetic storage should permit. Dr. Sarah Chun, a quantum computing researcher at MIT who studied declassified Cascade materials in 2018, published a paper suggesting that the Soviet engineers may have accidentally created a quantum storage medium using purely analog components. If true, this would mean they achieved a form of quantum computing decades before quantum computers existed, using nothing more than modified consumer electronics and creative materials science. The piezoelectric transduction mechanism itself relies on physics. That's straightforward in principle, but extraordinarily difficult to control in practice. When acoustic waves pass through crystalline structures like quartz, the mechanical stress creates electrical polarization, generating electromagnetic fields. The challenge is that this process is normally chaotic and inefficient, with most acoustic energy dissipating as heat. What Soviet geologists discovered in their 1976 seismic surveys was that specific locations on the ridge had quartz veins with unusual crystalline alignment, almost perfectly oriented to maximize transduction efficiency at certain frequencies. These natural formations acted like massive geologic-scale transducers, and their proximity to undersea communication cables created an opportunity for what cryptographers call a side-channel attack, exploiting unintended signal pathways to bypass security measures. The precision required to make this work was astounding. Andropov's playback timing had to be accurate too, within microseconds. His frequency selection had to match the piezoelectric resonance of rock formations 300 meters below the ocean floor, and the resulting electromagnetic pulse had to couple with fiber optic cables at exactly the right angle to induce evanescent waves rather than being reflected or absorbed. The fact that it worked at all suggests either extraordinary luck or a level of understanding about undersea geology and signal propagation that Western intelligence still finds concerning. Cryptographic analysis of the payload reveals architectural decisions that seem to anticipate problems the encoding would face during transmission and execution. The code included extensive error correction using Reed-Solomon algorithms that were state-of-the-art for the 1970s but applied in novel ways. It also featured what modern programmers would recognize as sandbox detection, routines designed to identify whether the code was running in its intended target environment or in an analysis system. and to behave differently in each case. This meant that when NSA cryptographers first attempted to execute the recovered payload in their test environment, it deliberately provided misleading information about its functionality, a level of operational security sophistication that most malware wouldn't achieve until decades later. The code's target was apparently NORAD's threat correlation system. Specifically, the modules responsible for analyzing incoming radar data and determining whether detected objects represented genuine threats by introducing subtle biases into how this system weighted certain variables. The payload could theoretically cause the system to misclassify Soviet aircraft or missiles, either ignoring them when they shouldn't be ignored or flagging false threats that would waste resources investigating. The implications were profound. Rather than trying to blind American defenses entirely, which would be immediately obvious, this approach aimed to make them slightly unreliable in ways that might not be noticed until a real crisis. The engineering required to modify the TPS Walkman into a precision signal generator speaks to the level of technical expertise Soviet engineers brought to the project. The standard Walkman's internal components were never designed for the precision timekeeping that Cascade required. Its motor speed varied based on battery voltage, temperature, and mechanical wear, making it unsuitable for applications requiring stable frequency output. The modifications addressed this by replacing the DC motor with a crystal-controlled stepper motor, salvaged from an experimental Soviet digital watch, and adding a servo control system that continuously adjusted playback speed based on feedback from the rubidium atomic clock. This level of miniaturization and integration was remarkable for 1979, when most precision timing equipment filled entire equipment racks. The phase-locked loop circuitry that maintained harmonic coherence was built using discrete components, individually hand-selected for matching characteristics, and calibrated over weeks of testing to achieve the necessary stability. Soviet technicians essentially created a laboratory-grade instrument that fit inside a consumer electronics case and ran on AA batteries. Western attempts to replicate this capability using period-appropriate technology were only partially successful, suggesting either that Soviet engineers had access to superior components, or that they developed assembly and calibration techniques that weren't documented in any recovered materials. Now, consider what we still don't know. The 1987 tape arrival in Helsinki raises questions that remain unanswered. Who sent it? The handwriting on the note has never been conclusively identified, though some analysts believe it matches samples from Yevgeny Andropov's personal correspondences, which would be impossible since he was still alive, and presumably under Soviet surveillance at that time. Why send it to American intelligence? If the Cascade project continued in secret, revealing its improvements to the adversary seems counterproductive unless the sender had reasons to want both sides to understand the technology's implications. Some researchers have proposed that the package was a warning, an attempt by someone involved in Cascade to ensure that Western defenses developed countermeasures. Perhaps because they feared their own side might deploy the capability in ways that could escalate conflicts. Others suggest it might have been a recruitment pitch, a demonstration of expertise meant to facilitate a defection that never occurred. The truth is, we simply don't know. And the people who might have known are either dead or not talking. There's also the question of whether Cascade was ever used operationally after the K-122 mission. Electromagnetic anomalies consistent with piezoelectric transduction have been detected near undersea cables in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Ocean at various times between 1979 and the present day. Most are attributed to natural geological processes, seismic activity that happens to generate electromagnetic effects, but some incidents remain unexplained. In 1984, NORAD experienced a brief malfunction in its threat assessment system that caused it to briefly classify a flock of migrating geese as an incoming missile attack. The error was corrected within seconds by human operators, but the specific nature of the computer malfunction was never fully explained in unclassified reports. In 1991, during the Soviet Union's final months, American SOS-US arrays detected unusual acoustic patterns in the Barents Sea that resembled the K-122 transmission profile, though no source was ever identified. And in 1998, a Chinese submarine was observed loitering near a major fiber optic junction in the South China Sea, conducting activities that naval intelligence described as acoustic surveys, though the specific nature of those surveys remains classified. These incidents might be coincidental, but they could also represent attempts by various nations to replicate or deploy Cascade-like capabilities, an underground technological arms race that the public has never been told about. The philosophical implications of Mallory's autonomous evolution hypotheses deserve serious consideration. If code can modify and improve itself over extended periods, learning from its environment and adapting to new challenges, where do we draw the line between sophisticated malware and actual artificial intelligence? The Cascade payload wasn't designed to pass the Turing test or engage in human-like reasoning, but its apparent ability to analyze its own structure, identify improvements, and implement them suggests a form of intelligence, however narrow. Modern AI researchers studying the declassified materials have noted structural similarities between the Cascade encoding scheme and certain types of genetic algorithms where solutions evolve through iterative improvement guided by fitness functions. This raises the disturbing possibility that the payload Mallory analyzed in 1987 wasn't just an update sent by Soviet programmers, but represented genuine autonomous development. The code rewriting itself based on some internal optimization criteria. If this interpretation is correct, then somewhere in the archives of electromagnetic noise captured from undersea cables over the past 4 decades might be signals representing continuing evolution of that original 1979 code, still running, still improving, still pursuing whatever objective its creators embedded in its initial design. We should also consider what Cascade reveals about the vulnerabilities inherent in our interconnected technological infrastructure. The fact that analog audio played through consumer electronics could theoretically compromise one of the world's most secure military networks demonstrates that security is not just about encryption algorithms and access controls, but about understanding and controlling every possible signal pathway, including those that seem physically implausible. Modern cybersecurity faces similar challenges with supply chain attacks, where adversaries compromise hardware or software at the manufacturing level, long before it reaches its intended target. The gadolinium-doped cassette tapes produced in East Berlin represent an early example of this approach, creating malicious capability embedded in a physical medium that appeared harmless. Today's threats involve compromised router firmware, malicious updates to enterprise software, and hardware implants in semiconductor manufacturing. But the principle remains the same. If you can introduce malicious capability upstream in the production or distribution process, you can bypass many downstream security measures. The geopolitical context of 1979 helps explain why both sides were pursuing such exotic attack vectors. This was the height of Cold War tension, with proxy wars in Afghanistan, Central America and Africa, arms control negotiations that would produce the SALT Treaty, and genuine fear of nuclear escalation on both sides. Intelligence agencies were under enormous pressure to develop capabilities that could provide strategic advantage without triggering direct military confrontation. Cascade represented exactly this kind of capability. a method to potentially degrade enemy command and control systems while maintaining plausible deniability. Since the attack vector was so unusual that even if detected, it might be dismissed as equipment, malfunction, or natural phenomena. The fact that the Soviet Union went to such elaborate lengths to develop and deploy this system suggests they believed it could provide real strategic value, either as an operational capability or as a bargaining chip in intelligence negotiations. The American response, keeping the incident highly classified for decades while attempting to replicate the technology, indicates they took the threat seriously and saw potential value in developing similar capabilities. What makes the entire Cascade story particularly intriguing is how it blends obsolescence and cutting-edge innovation. The TPSL to Walkman was already becoming outdated by 1979 as Sony prepared to release improved models with better sound quality and more features. Cassette tapes were mature technology, widely understood, and soon to be superseded by digital formats. Yet by combining these mundane components with advanced material science, precise engineering, and creative exploitation of natural phenomena, Soviet engineers created something genuinely novel and threatening. This pattern appears repeatedly in intelligence history. The best attacks often exploit the gap between what security designers think is possible and what creative adversaries actually achieve. Modern equivalents might include using smart light bulbs to exfiltrate data via modulated flickering imperceptible to human eyes, or exploiting acoustic emanations from capacitors to reconstruct encryption keys. Attacks that seem absurd until someone demonstrates they work. The question of whether anything like Cascade could work today is both simpler and more complex than it might appear. On one hand, modern communication infrastructure is fundamentally digital, using protocols and encryption that should be immune to the kind of analog signal injection that Cascade attempted. Fiber optic cables are designed to be exceptionally resistant to external electromagnetic interference, and the signal processing systems that receive data from them include extensive validation and error correction that would reject malformed packets. On the other hand, the underlying physics hasn't changed. Piezoelectric translation still works. Acoustic electromagnetic conversion still occurs in crystalline materials, and fiber optic cables still emit small amounts of electromagnetic radiation that theoretically could be influenced by external fields under the right conditions. The question is whether modern security measures have closed the vulnerability completely, or merely made exploitation more difficult. Given that new side-channel attacks continue to be discovered regularly, and that nation-states invest heavily in finding novel attack vectors, it seems unwise to assume any system is truly immune to creative exploitation. We're left with more questions than answers, which might be exactly the point. The incomplete declassification of Cascade materials, the missing persons and dead ends in the investigation, the ambiguous evidence of continued development, all contribute to an atmosphere of uncertainty that may serve strategic purposes for multiple parties. If adversaries believe you possess capabilities you might not actually have, they must invest in defenses, diverting resources from other priorities. If they know you're aware of specific vulnerabilities, they might avoid exploiting them for fear of revealing their own knowledge. The information warfare aspect of intelligence operations means that what people believe about capabilities can be as important as the capabilities themselves. The Cascade story, with its mixture of confirmed facts and unresolved mysteries, might be partially shaped by this consideration, crafted to send messages to multiple audiences simultaneously, while revealing only what serves specific strategic interests. Consider the metadata problem inherent in this entire narrative. Every source we have about Cascade comes filtered through classification review, which means someone decided what information to release and what to keep secret. The documents that have been declassified might be the ones that serve current policy goals, while the truly sensitive material remains locked away. This selection bias means we're trying to reconstruct events from deliberately curated evidence, like solving a puzzle where some pieces have been removed and others might be misdirection. Some researchers who've studied Cascade materials believe certain declassified documents contain deliberate errors or anachronisms, possibly to obscure the true timeline of events or to protect sources and methods still considered sensitive. If this is true, then the story, as we understand it, might be substantially incomplete or partly fictional. A cover story designed to explain what was observed without revealing operational details that remain classified. The technological legacy of Cascade extends beyond military applications into civilian research. Scientists studying quantum information storage have examined the gadolinium-doped tape technology with interest, recognizing that it achieved results that shouldn't have been possible with classical magnetic recording. While modern quantum computing uses entirely different approaches, involving supercooled qubits and quantum entanglement generated through controlled processes. The principle that quantum effects can be harnessed using relatively simple materials and methods remains relevant. Similarly, research into acoustic electromagnetic conversion has applications in energy harvesting, where waste vibrations from machinery or environmental sources could be converted into electrical power, and in sensing applications, where monitoring electromagnetic emissions from buried infrastructure could detect structural problems or security breaches. The fact that Soviet engineers in the 1970s achieved functional results in these domains using improvised methods suggests that there might be simpler, more robust approaches to some quantum and acoustic technologies than current mainstream research assumes. There's an almost poetic quality to the idea of music being weaponized as a carrier for malicious code. Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, known as the Path, is one of the composer's most emotionally intense works, ending unusually with a slow movement filled with despair and resignation. That Soviet engineers chose this particular piece as camouflage for their payload adds a layer of dark irony to the operation. The symphony's final movement, fading into silence, mirrors the way the Cascade signal was, designed to infiltrate target systems, present but imperceptible, waiting to execute its programmed purpose. Whether this selection was deliberate symbolism or simple convenience, using one of Russian culture's most celebrated artistic achievements as a vehicle for Cold War espionage, encapsulates the contradictions of that era, where scientific brilliance and cultural sophistication coexisted with paranoia and mutual assured destruction. So what actually happened that November night in 1979? Based on available evidence, a Soviet submarine equipped with modified consumer electronics transmitted an encoded signal through hundreds of kilometers of ocean and rock, briefly coupling with undersea cables and inducing anomalous electromagnetic effects in one of America's most secure military installations. The transmission lasted 9 minutes and may have successfully injected malicious code into computer systems that weren't designed to defend against such an exotic attack vector. American intelligence detected the intrusion, partially reverse engineered the methodology, but never fully understood all aspects of how it worked or what it was ultimately intended to achieve. The technology involved combined mature analog systems with advanced materials and creative exploitation of natural phenomena in ways that anticipated concepts from quantum computing and adaptive malware by decades. Multiple aspects of the incident remain classified or unexplained, and some evidence suggests the capability may have continued to develop autonomously after its initial deployment. We don't know if Cascade was ever used operationally again, whether other nations successfully replicated the technology, or what happened to the people most directly involved in its creation and deployment. What we do know is that this incident represents a remarkable example of how technological innovation often occurs at the intersection of different disciplines. How security vulnerabilities can emerge from unexpected combinations of seemingly unrelated systems, and how the pursuit of strategic advantage during the Cold War drove intelligence agencies to explore extraordinarily creative approaches to electronic warfare. The Cascade Project pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible with 1970s technology, and in doing so, it revealed principles and vulnerabilities that remain relevant to modern cybersecurity and quantum information science. Whether the full truth will ever be declassified remains uncertain. But the partial story we have access to is already remarkable enough to warrant continued investigation and analysis. If you found this deep dive into Cold War acoustic espionage fascinating, there's so much more to explore in the intersection of obsolete technology and modern security. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we'll be investigating more classified incidents where the boundaries between possible and impossible weren't quite where anyone expected them to be. Drop your theories in the comments about what you think was really on that cassette tape, what happened to the people involved, or whether Cascade-style attacks might still be happening today. This is exactly the kind of technical mystery that thrives on collective investigation. So share what you know or what you think you know, and let's see what patterns emerge.